So every week now, I'm joined by my friend, my buddy Michael Johns. He's joining us right now. He's a commentator, policy analyst, former speechwriter for George H.W. Bush, one of the co-founders of the Tea Party. Hey, Mike, how you doing today? Welcome.
Good, John. Happy Friday to you.
Happy Friday to you. So, Mike, I guess there's a lot going on now. There's a lot of mixed messages out there. Some states are going back full bore. Other states like Virginia have extended the stay at home until June already. It's the first day of May. There's a big argument out there, right, between public health and constitutional liberties. And I'm reading the social sphere, and you say, well, how come companies like Walmart can be trusted to have their employees around people, but the local hardware store or the local butcher shop, they can't be? There should be one standard now. How bad is this for civil liberties?
I think from the very beginning, this entire pandemic has raised some intriguing legal questions, and those intriguing legal questions, I think, are only going to get more intriguing as the crisis begins to alleviate and the public health threat diminishes. We have crucial, I think, First Amendment, Second Amendment, 10th Amendment, even issues that are arising as it relates to the powers of government. And some of these are like completely unprecedented in our lifetime. So how the American people respond to them, how they're handled in the courts, how particularly state and municipal governments handle them is very important. Now, of course, for our Tea Party movement, we have always said from the very beginning that government needs to be held accountable by the people. I think that continues to be true. And I see kind of, for the most part, deviate a little bit from some of these protests. I think for the most part, on the federal level, we've seen an administration that's been almost very meticulous, really, in ensuring that the steps that they've taken have been within the confines of constitutional empowerments afforded them. You've not seen blanket orders. You've not seen imposition of policies or guidelines that would be inappropriate to impose on states or municipalities. And instead, you've seen, general guidance, which of course is without a whole lot of legal concern. But on the state and municipal levels, we're starting to see a lot of really intriguing issues and questions. I think there are ones related to religious liberty and the practice thereof, where a good number of municipalities have prohibited even drive-through or drive-in religious services. There's been a number of communities that have shut down gun stores as non-essential, as deeming them non-essential, while other commercial and retail enterprises have remained open. And then there's even some First Amendment free speech issues in Newark, New Jersey, for instance. A new regulation that's actually empowering it to prosecute false information communicated about the pandemic, which of course, sadly in this media age, we get false information communicated all the time. It's clearly First Amendment issues. San Jose, California, a good example of a municipality that's forced gun shops to close while other commercial enterprises have remained open. And then I think, a final point has been this free passage issue, where you've had, like in Rhode Island, the governor essentially ordering the stopping of vehicles with New York license plates and, attempting to preclude individuals from entering the state, which, seems to raise probable cause, Fourth Amendment issues, all sorts of other issues. So this is a critical moment, obviously, for the country. And it is a balancing act, obviously, between maintaining the public health and maintaining our constitutional liberties. Neither of those are ultimately compromisable, but in so many ways, they ultimately end up inevitably on a collision course.
Yeah. So, Mike, I want to bifurcate those two issues for a minute here. I saw a clever meme on social media that was talking about, well, how come I can go to my local bakery and they can come outside and bring me a crumb bun wrapped in cellophane, but I can't go to my church and pick up a bunch of palm wrapped in cellophane? So there's been a little bit of a double standard, it seems. And I've even heard from people in the South where they said that their pastor came out in the parking lot and people were pulling up in their cars, and the cops came on scene and broke the people up for being in their cars in the parking lot of their church. So is the church somewhat under attack in the middle of this?
Yeah, it might be an exaggeration to say under attack, but I think when you look at the examples of the violations of liberties throughout this pandemic, First Amendment free religious rights and religious rights to assemble are the ones that have seemed to be, most endangered, and seem to be the ones that are, also being pretty aggressively challenged. Mississippi, in this case, Temple Baptist Church in Greenville, actually prevented drive-through shortwave radio broadcast of their Easter services, and the U.S. Justice Department under Attorney General Barr, I think he's doing a really good job in the sense that they actually joined with a statement of interest and support of the plaintiffs in this case, saying, look, yeah, absolutely, this is a First Amendment violation. Louisville, Kentucky, basically same story, drive-in religious services that were precluded, and that would actually ended up in the D.C. Circuit Court, and this new federal judge that Trump had appointed, Justin Walker, ruled in support of the plaintiffs that in fact was a violation of expression of free religion. So these are all intriguing, and I think importantly, Barr came out with this memorandum on Monday to all of the Justice Department's federal prosecutors. Basically, one of the quotes that I pulled out was, if a state or local ordinance crosses the line from an appropriate exercise of authority to stop the spread of COVID-19 into an overbearing infringement of constitutional and statutory protections, the Department of Justice may have an obligation to address that overreach in federal court. So in essence, Barr asking the Department of Justice to scrutinize the state and municipal policies, guidelines, regulations, statutes, and to single out any that appear to be constitutional violations. And I think that's very admirable and laudatory, and one of the basically another component of positive leadership really in this administration throughout this crisis.
Well, it is good to see that the president is asking the attorney general to make sure that there's not too much overreach. But I mean, we've already been subject to a tremendous amount of overreach, in my view. And I think most Americans, thinking it's in the cause of public health, have been really good about it. But I think just human nature tells you that if you keep people cooped up much longer, you got to really weigh what the negatives are: mental health, substance abuse, domestic violence, all these other things start to be the other side of the fulcrum. And, at this point, I think everyone's well aware of how dangerous and contagious this disease could be. There are all kinds of measures that have been laid out to us by the federal and state government. If you want to go back to work and you want to start to get back to some semblance of life, I think people are going to use their best judgment to wear masks, social distance, try to do their best not to put themselves in harm's way. But many people, I think, and many people every day take risks in going to all kinds of different jobs, and they get paid more or less based on how much risk they take going to their workplace. When you weigh it against zero, I think on the risk-reward meter, some people are willing to take a little more risk and take their own health and self-care into accommodation and get back to work because the government can't seem to stimulate enough here.
Yeah, and I think that's what's intriguing about what's going to happen here in the next few months is we have the guidelines and the regulations that have been questioned over the past few weeks as to whether they are or are not constitutional in light of a pandemic and a public health threat. But now in the coming months, if, as I think is pretty broadly anticipated, we're going to start to see improvements in the public health conditions. The question doesn't just become, are these ordinances and regulations constitutional, but the second question will be, are we in fact facing the public health threat that warrants the imposition of them? And I think that's going to be increasingly questioned with states that are too slow to proceed in reopening their respective economies. You've got a good number of states that are kind of really pursuing a pretty admirable course of incremental reopening processes. And we're in a presidential election year where you can't dismiss the possibility of politics entering into consideration of some of these decisions. And that's going to really, I think, require the citizens of all these respective states to be attentive and to be, calling out and even in, with litigation if necessary, cases that are unjustifiable or that are in fact undue impositions, given the state of public health in their respective states.
So, and the other thing you touched on was some states are using this to infringe on people's Second Amendment rights. I would think, I guess it's just a given that food and shelter is a right of Americans. It's in the Constitution that the right to bear arms. What would make them think that is somehow correlated, closing gun shops in a time when many people are petrified?
Yeah, I think that, the factual argument would be that particularly in a moment of a national emergency, where police responsiveness and law enforcement may not be as readily available, Second Amendment rights actually become a tad bit more important, not less important. And yet here we have a good number of states, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New York, various areas there, and I mentioned California, that have taken initiatives of deeming gun shops as non-essential operations and basically closed them down. Well, in closing those down and also in taking measures that make it difficult to obtain licensing, those are pretty clear-cut violations of obvious Second Amendment rights to keep and bear arms. And those two, I think, really warrant getting into the courts, because sadly, we have a good number of elected officials in this country, some at a governor level, who don't have a very strongly held view of First and Second Amendment importance and the vitality and crucial nature that maintains to American liberty, and how important it is that those be maintained. And this crisis, I think, is really kind of starting to graphically call out some of those issues.
Well, I got to tell you that I'm hoping that life changes a little bit here, and as we get back to normal, I think people are starting to accept everything as, oh, we just got to do it. I'm hoping as we start to come out of it here, some of the simple ones like church and guns and school will be allowed to happen again. I don't know so much about schools because we're so close to the end of the year, maybe not put the kids in harm's way.
One thing on the schools, which I think is an intriguing argument, the Heritage Foundation and their coronavirus task force made this argument. I thought it was a really good one, is that, when you look at parents who have been taxed for public school systems, meaning they've paid in, as all community members have paid into these systems, and then they essentially had several months of this, academic year cut off, and those services were not provided as promised. Are parents not, in fact, due some sort of rebate that could potentially be used for online education or tutoring or textbooks, things of that nature that would supplement the lost educational services as a result of these schools getting closed? I think that's an issue that really ought to be more aggressively pursued and explored. That's obviously also a local and state issue. But we have had taxpayers taxed for educational services that absolutely have not been rendered as a result of this pandemic.
Yeah, and I live in New York, but I know my friends over in the Garden State in New Jersey pay a boatload of real estate taxes, and college is free and all this other stuff to state residents. I wonder, how much of that is not being spent. They don't have campuses open. They're not feeding kids. There's probably, when cities and states are asking the feds for money, maybe they should take into account whatever opportunity cost or savings there was in not having to actually run the facilities.
Right. I mean, clearly have some, existing overhead. No one's saying there's no expense that continues to be incurred, but a lot of that incremental expense has been waived. They're not having to run electricity in these buildings. The students themselves are not receiving the services that were anticipated or were promised under federal and state statutes. And the fact that the taxpayers are still on the hook for services that are not being provided, it should be concerning to all taxpayers.
Well, I think there's a lot to be concerned with, but I'm just hoping that as we go into May here, it seems like the numbers everywhere are dropping off, except for in some really small pockets, and it does sure seem like a big hunk of all the deaths were happening in or around nursing homes, which seem to be a major hotspot. I think if they can get those people protected. And now with testing getting out there, if you've been tested in the last month and you've been positive, then you should feel pretty good about it. And I have to tell you, when everybody's saying there's no testing, there can't be testing, I thought I had some symptoms of this now. Knowing what I know now, I thought I had some symptoms myself back in January. So I called my doctor yesterday and said, hey, I may have to start getting out. I may go back to the studio. I may actually even have to do some travel for work. Can I get tested? They set me up with a telephone appointment, a FaceTime appointment with someone that day. And then this morning I got a call from the test facility to say I can come in any time today. So it doesn't seem like it's that difficult to access. Maybe it's easier here in New York, but I got an appointment in one day.
Well, I think a few things there. Number one is you got to look at, as the administration's correctly saying, the fact that you've got kind of New York and New Jersey comprising over 40% of the total cases and total deaths throughout this crisis. Those are two states that obviously need to be looked at almost separately from the other 48. And you got a good number of states where the number of cases are on a per capita basis very minimal. And nothing really precluding them immediately from reopening with some basic rudimentary, distancing policies and whatnot for preventative purposes. So it really is ultimately a state decision. That's the importance of the 10th Amendment. And I think as it relates to what you said about the testing, absolutely. I mean, the one thing that cannot be denied is this administration has moved mountains to get supplies to states and locales and healthcare facilities around the country, even though it's not a primary federal government responsibility, it's a state responsibility. And they've picked up some of the slack of some of the states that actually were ill prepared for this. And I would put New York in that category. Cuomo's decision to put patients into nursing homes early on in this pandemic has been attributed to one of the reasons that New York has had such a disproportionate impact of the coronavirus on it compared to other states. And it really is astonishing to me, honestly, that his approval ratings have gone up, because really, if you were going to look at any singular state that has poorly managed this crisis, at least on a statistical basis, you'd have to start and say, look, whatever's been done in New York, what's ever been done in New Jersey are almost some of the things to look at to potentially avoid.
Yeah, let's not do that.
Not to highlight his success stories. It clearly is not all their fault. You cannot put all of the blame on the governors of these two states, but you certainly can't hold them out as examples on how to manage this crisis either. They were both ill prepared. They had both made early errors, and you have to keep coming back to the fact that one of the most important constructive decisions that's been made throughout this entire pandemic was the president's January 31 decision to cut off travel from China, and the fact that almost no one out there.
Thank God he did that.
Thank God, because really, you look at it, there wasn't a lot of call within. No Democrat that every Democrat I'm aware of condemned the act.
Right.
Obviously, as you recall, Biden called it xenophobic and racist. It presumably would have allowed Chinese travel to have continued into February, into March. Who knows even now if he would have stopped it. So on that basis, and then you look at the media were critical of him. China called it an unfriendly measure. The WHO did not support it. The president was pretty almost alone, and I'm sure that not all of the counsel he got, even in his own administration, was universal in support of this. And I think you got to give a lot of tribute to his leadership in putting in place that travel restriction because while we've lost over 60,000 lives to this to date, which is an extraordinary number, and it cannot and should not ever be downplayed. This is the biggest public health
Terrible.
crisis since the
Terrible
Spanish
number.
flu. Since the Spanish flu, the biggest crisis this country's confronted public health wise, that you could potentially put another zero behind that number if he had not put into place that travel ban. And he deserves a lot of praise. And remember, it wasn't just China, but then he came back and put it in for, South Korea, and put it in ultimately for Europe, which was equally controversial and opposed. And those have ultimately been the most constructive decisions that have been made in the management of this thing. Because ultimately, there's not a single bullet solution to a pandemic of this nature when you don't have a vaccine. The vaccine, I guess, in theory, would ultimately be that silver bullet. But the travel restrictions were the singular most important reform and executive decision that could be made in limiting the damage that this has presented from wherever it emerged within China. And I assume and hope that we're going to learn some more details on that, because it certainly does appear to me that China is culpable in this, and they're going to have some degree of pretty broad and massive, I think, financial responsibility if there's any degree of justice in the way this is handled.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on all fronts. Mike, thanks so much for joining us again on Friday. I hope you and the family stay safe, and hopefully we can get back out into at least pointed in the right direction of back to civilization as we once know it. But thank you so much, brother.
Have a good weekend, John.